Over 10 years ago, I was experiencing multiple layers of mental health issues, and these were effectively completely destroying my life. This included things like depersonalization, derealization disorder, video game addiction, high levels of anxiety and depression, and also a much lesser known mental health issue called maladaptive daydreaming. And this was something where I effectively was addicted to daydreaming and I just could not stop doing it. So by far my most popular video is on maladaptive daydreaming, and my biggest request has been in going more into exactly how I overcame maladaptive daydreaming. So if you haven't seen that video, I'll put a link in the description up here. Highly recommend you check that out because I go into explaining what maladaptive daydreaming is in more detail. But in this video, I want to focus more on going into detail into what I did to overcome this issue. But before I do that, please remember, I am not a mental health professional, I'm not a therapist, not a psychiatrist or psychologist. I'm somebody who's gone through the experience of overcoming all of these mental health issues, and I'm just presenting and sharing what I've learned in recovery so that you can also start your recovery journey and you can get tips on how you can improve your situation. This is my own opinion, it's based on my own experiences. This should not be a replacement for professional health advice. Okay, so what is maladaptive daydreaming briefly? So daydreaming is something that we all do, and that's very normal. This is when our mind starts wandering and we go off into imaginations, maybe thinking about something. That's normal because usually it only happens for a very short period of time, like 5 seconds, 10 seconds, maybe even a minute, but we can quite easily bring our minds back to reality and carry on with doing what we were doing. That's very normal. With maladaptive daydreaming, it becomes an issue because it's not just that we daydream for long periods of time, it's that we cannot control our mind when it starts to daydream. So not only will we be doing something and then in the snap of a finger we get lost in a daydream, all of a sudden we realize, oh my god, half an hour is gone, an hour is gone. So the length of time is significantly more compared to somebody who doesn't have maladaptive daydreaming. And it becomes this compulsion, this habit and addiction where we keep daydreaming throughout the day, and so much time gets wasted and so much focus disappears, and it can feel like the day just vanishes because we spent so much time in our heads daydreaming. And so back in the day when this was a serious issue for me, it effectively felt like I had lost control over the most basic aspect of my mind, which was the ability to just focus on the external world, because my mind kept pulling me into my internal world, into my imagination. And as you can imagine, this can be very scary and will affect it was affecting every aspect of my life. And that was on top of all of the other mental health issues which I had. So first thing I had to do to overcome maladaptive daydreaming is to understand, why was I daydreaming so much? Why was it becoming an addiction? So I first recognized at the time that I had multiple mental health issues, as I mentioned before. And I learned that all of these mental health issues were occurring because of years of chronic stress and also certain traumatic events that I had experienced. So the first point to understand, and I'm sure this applies to other people with maladaptive daydreaming, is that at the time I was experiencing this, it was a way to cope with overwhelming stress, unreleased, unresolved traumas, and all of the mental health issues I was experiencing as a result of that. So maladaptive daydreaming was a coping mechanism. It was my mind's way, almost like a defense mechanism, a way to cope with the overwhelming issues I was having at the time. It was my mind's way of trying to reduce the suffering I was experiencing. One way of looking at it was my mind's way of adapting to that psychological, emotional situation that I experienced for a long period of time. So we can also say it's a coping mechanism and a psychological adaptation to chronic stress and unresolved trauma. So if we keep this in mind, this means that the maladaptive daydreaming is not actually the root cause of the issue. It's actually a symptom of something else, because the maladaptive daydreaming is a way to cope with the stress and the trauma. So then I realized I had to look deeper. I had to look at what is causing this chronic stress and what is causing this trauma to not be resolved, because maladaptive daydreaming is simply a symptom of that. Then the second thing I had to understand and to look at was, when was I actually experiencing maladaptive daydreaming? What was the process? What was actually happening? So I had to look for what would trigger a maladaptive daydream experience. And so what I noticed was I actually wasn't doing it randomly. There was an actual pattern to this. And the simple pattern was, whenever I would experience high amounts of stress, I was more likely to start daydreaming. I know that sounds simple, so to go into more detail, it was when I would have an experience, let's say during the day, that was very stressful back in the past. I would notice that I would want to start daydreaming. I'd see my mind trying to wander off. But I also noticed that if I was around people, I wouldn't daydream. So I noticed there was clearly some level of control that I did have. I just didn't know how to control it. So I realized, okay, my mind, I must be subconsciously not actually starting to daydream because I know there are other people around, so it'll become obvious. So I realized there is a mechanism in there which switches it on and off. And then of course I noticed the opposite. The days where I didn't really have much stress, but there was a much lower level of stress, I didn't really daydream as much. It still would happen, but it wasn't for like half an hour, 40 minutes. It would be maybe a minute, 2 minutes, and I had a lot more control over it. So again, I noticed, okay, there's a pattern and there is clearly a level of control that's there, and there is also clearly something that is triggering it to make it worse or not as bad. And when I looked further into this, notice the pattern, I noticed, well, it's because I was experiencing the stress from all of the other mental health issues I was having. So because of the depersonalization disorder symptoms, the high anxiety and the depression, the more that these symptoms were about, the more likely I was to start having those maladaptive daydream experiences. What I observed was really it was the overwhelming experience of all of these things put together. So the intense negative emotions, the negative racing thoughts, that stressful experience of having high levels of anxiety, the fear that would come from experiencing the dissociative symptoms of depersonalization disorder. All of these things you can imagine would be overwhelming for anyone. So my mind, I believe, had to invent another way to cope, which is to start daydreaming to escape it. The stronger these mental health issues were, the longer and more stronger the maladaptive daydreaming experiences would be. So for me, I noticed that was a key trigger. Then the third thing I had to understand was, as I mentioned before, I noticed, well, there must be a mechanism to this. It's not completely random, since there is clearly something for me where there was a pattern in it being triggered. So I thought, okay, well, if there's something triggering it, are there also instances where I can manually get myself to trigger a daydream? And well, yeah, of course. I think most of us, if we want to, if we have, because I know not everybody has a strong imagination, some people don't have the ability to necessarily imagine things in their mind. I've always had a strong imagination, so which doesn't help if you have maladaptive daydreaming like I did back in the day. So I realized, okay, well, if I can purposefully choose to daydream and then stop, that's actually that mechanism being used. So I thought, well, that's probably what I have to learn to train. So to explain this a bit more, let's say for now you imagine, let's say a pyramid, like the pyramids in Egypt. Let's say you imagine that right now in your mind. And then let's say you stop thinking about that and think of let's look at whatever's in front of you. And now you've switched your point of attention, right? So now you're no longer, I assume, you're no longer imagining what was in your mind, and now you're looking at whatever's ahead of you. So the way I see it, I realized, well, if I do this, I'm imagining something, having a small daydream, and then I'm stopping doing it. So clearly I can control it when I want. And what's happening with maladaptive daydreaming is my mind is controlling it as an automatic habit. So that was the difference I had to understand. So then I asked the question, well, how has it become an automatic habit? And I realized, well, probably at some point when I started to have these mental health issues and they became overwhelming, either my mind must have started to create these daydreams, or maybe I manually, without realizing, without me being aware, was starting to daydream, and then I kept doing it potentially over and over and over again, which then made it an automatic habit, which is why my mind kept doing it over and over again without me wanting to actually do that. Or I thought maybe it's a bit of both, where my mind was trying to find a way to escape, so it was creating these daydreams for me, and I was, going into them in my mind, or maybe sometimes I was creating them as a way to escape. And then at some point it became mixed together, and it became automatic habit. As if we do anything over and over again, it becomes an automatic habit, and then we don't have to actually think about doing it. So I realized this is probably what was happening with maladaptive daydreaming. So this is in a way good news, because the way I saw it, well, this is a habit. Habits can be, you can create a habit, and you can also overwrite habits with different habits. So I thought, well, okay, there must be a way then for me to stop daydreaming all the time. So I had to look at, how can I train myself to not daydream? Now, please understand, this is only one half of how I solved it, because of course there is the underlying issue, which was I had to go into resolving the chronic stress and the other mental health issues. And I go into how I resolve those in many of my other videos, if you check them out as well. But in this particular point, the way I trained my mind to overcome maladaptive daydreaming, that habit aspect, was through mindfulness meditation. And that's because there are so many meditations out there. If you Google mindfulness meditation or concentration meditation, you'll see there are many of them which train you to control your point of attention. And that's what was essentially being hijacked with maladaptive daydreaming, where you're doing something and then your mind goes, nope, we're just going to take your attention and put it into your daydream, and then you just get stuck there. So I realized that was the problem, where I didn't know how to actually control my point of attention. So I realized, well, meditation actually is what teaches that, because it makes you have to control your point of attention until eventually it becomes a habit, and you learn, just like any muscle, for example. It's like a muscle. The more you do it, the more you learn to control it. So that's the main thing I was doing. I was practicing mindfulness meditation. And then what this meant was, at first, I couldn't stop myself from daydreaming, even though I was practicing for several weeks daily to meditate. I still meditate after 5 years. I do it every day, but at that point it had only been like a couple of weeks, maybe a month. So what it meant was the daydreaming would still happen, but then because I had trained myself to be more aware of what was going on and to control my point of attention, this meant that I was able to snap out of a daydream faster and faster, because I had learned through meditation how to control my point of attention, my point of awareness. So my mind will create a daydream, and I'd realize, oh, I'm daydreaming. And I'd know through practice how to bring my attention back. So that was the first stage of the practice, where I couldn't actually control it from bringing me into a daydream, but I could actually control it going out. So I became quicker and quicker at stopping that. Mindfulness meditation also means when you practice it, it stops you from being attached to your thoughts and to the images that your mind creates. So it means, like, I could get pulled into a daydream, but I could also actually realize I am being pulled into a daydream. So I'd be able to watch my mind doing it and be like, oh, look, I'm in the daydream. Okay, I need to get out of this. Whereas, as we know with maladaptive daydreaming, you don't actually necessarily know when the daydream started. All you know is you're doing something, and then before you know it, you're daydreaming, and then maybe half an hour goes by, an hour goes by, and you're like, oh my God, what was I doing? And you realize, oh wow, an hour has gone, and you don't actually remember when the daydream happened. That's always been a scary thing. I remember when you get pulled in, you're like, when did that happen? But with mindfulness meditation, because you're training your point of attention, you can catch yourself actually going into it and then quickly go out, or at least much faster go out. It also meant, because I was learning in mindfulness meditation to observe my thoughts and my emotions, I wouldn't believe everything it was telling me, because sometimes people can have daydreams that actually aren't that great. As in, they're not necessarily nice daydreams, which sounds counterintuitive, because you would think that with maladaptive daydream that it would always be nice daydreams to escape, but I realized that's not always actually true. So what mindfulness meditation did was, when I would get painful emotions or have those stronger mental health experiences, like I mentioned before, like with depersonalization, what would happen is I was now able to sit with the painful emotions and to sit with those experiences and to not necessarily quickly go into a daydream, because mindfulness meditation trains us to sit with those feelings. So when we have difficult emotions and want to get away with them, we can again train our point of attention to go back into those feelings, because that's the only way to actually properly experience them and to go through them, to release them, is to actually sit with them. So mindfulness meditation wasn't only just training my point of attention, training me not to get caught up in the thoughts and the images in my mind, it was also training me to sit with the emotions, that was really one of the key triggers of maladaptive daydreaming. Painful emotions would come up, painful psychological experiences would come up, and then I would try to escape it maladaptive daydreaming. So instead, this was teaching me to sit with it. So that meant over time, I was daydreaming less and less and less, because I was training my mind to not be afraid of it and to show, look, it's safe, you can sit with these feelings, you can experience these psychological experiences, and it's okay. It trained me to be able to accept them as they were. Now, I know that many of you have asked you've asked the question, well, how do you practice mindfulness meditation? So I do intend to do a video specifically on that. A quick explanation of what I normally would do, a very basic mindfulness meditation is, so you just bring your point of attention, you make sure no distractions, set aside 5 minutes, 10 minutes, ideally longer, but if that's the most you can do, that's fine. Even a few minutes is good. And what you do is, you ideally want to sit or stand. I don't suggest lying down because you might fall asleep. What you're doing is you're bringing your attention to your breathing and just watching it. And when you notice your awareness, your point of attention is getting lost in your thoughts, what you're really doing is just watching them. So you're not adding thoughts and creating thoughts to comment on what you're experiencing in your mind or in your body and your emotions. You're training yourself just to observe it. And at first it looks like you feel like, oh, well, I'm not doing anything. But as with any exercise, it takes time. And you'll notice the more you do this, the more you can have thoughts and not react to them. Or you can have emotions and not just react. Instead, they'll come and you can observe them and then choose how you're going to react. And I know for many people that may sound strange, but it's one of those things where you have to practice it and you'll fully understand what it means. So to recap, for 5-10 minutes, make sure no distractions, and ideally no music. I know some people like to have like meditation music or some kind of guided meditation. That can help at the beginning, but ideally you don't want any distraction, because you want to experience your thoughts and your emotions fully, and you want to be able to just learn to observe it. And the more you do this, it becomes easier to sit with the emotions. So when you notice your point of attention getting lost, you simply bring it back to your breathing. And if you notice it going to your emotions, accept whatever's there, but then bring your point of attention back to your breathing. And through doing this over and over again, you're training your muscle of being able to control your attention. So it means if you do get stuck into a daydream, you would have taught yourself to not be attached to the thoughts, so you can easily observe and not get sucked into it. And you can control your attention to what you were doing again. But again, it takes practice. It does require patience. I honestly only saw results maybe after a month, maybe a month and a half. And again, that was just the beginning of it. For some people, it may be quicker. It's going to depend. I did it every single day. I had to do that. So I highly recommend, in the meantime, to go. There's tons of mindfulness meditation practice on YouTube alone, probably thousands of them. So look it up. Test them out. Ideally, you want to stick to one that's very simple, and you want to try and stick to one where it works for you. And yeah, ideally, I'd say no music, but maybe you could start with the music ones or the guided meditations to start, just to get an idea of what you're doing. But as I mentioned before, that's just one half of what I did to recover. So apart from understanding why I was experiencing maladaptive daydreaming, and then understanding what was triggering it, and then understanding that I needed to train myself to control my point of attention and to not get attached to the thoughts and to try to escape the difficult experiences I was having at the time. Ultimately, those were the root causes. So just training yourself to control point of attention isn't going to resolve necessarily the root causes. So for me, it was the long-term chronic stress and the mental health issues. So for me, I had to go right into resolving those. So the number one thing I did was I went for therapy, and I've been to therapy previously many times in my life. That was just for me the amount of work I had to do. Maybe it'll be shorter for you, maybe you won't have to go for as long as I did or as many times as I did. I just had that many issues that I had to work through with different therapists. And the key thing to understand is, with a therapist, with a licensed psychiatrist or psychologist, whichever one you use, they will help you to work through the trauma, to find ways to release and let go, and to understand what you can do to reduce the stress that you may be experiencing, where it's coming from. So really you have another objective person, somebody who's can look from the outside at your situation and find strategies to be able to resolve whatever issues may be going on in your life, and also to understand your patterns that maybe you, without realizing, may have that are contributing to the situation as well. One of the main things that can help you to see is that you have mental, physical, and emotional needs that need to be met and likely have not been met for a very, very long time. And this is actually the root cause of why there is chronic stress and trauma. And a therapist or psychiatrist, psychologist will be trained to help you to identify this and then how to meet those needs. And that for me is what resolved the issues. So being able to learn why I was experiencing, the patterns of behavior, life experiences that led to this, and then to see what needs, psychological, emotional, physical needs were not being met, and then how to meet those. That was really the key thing that I learned. And of course, when I say meet those needs, I mean in healthy ways, because there are of course many unhealthy ways to meet these needs. Examples of these could be having a lack of self-worth, lack of sleep, lack of proper nutrition, lack of boundaries, for example. And all of these can come from traumatic and stressful experiences we may have experienced in the past. And for me, the moment I learned how to keep continuously improving my self-worth, I noticed a lot of the experience I was having in terms of mental health issues started to drastically improve. So for me, that was one of the root underlying issues that was causing, or at least making, some of the mental health issues I had much more difficult to deal with. So therapy helped with that. In therapy and also in my own observations, I noticed that with maladaptive daydreaming, there were patterns in the types of daydream I was having. So when I mentioned there are unhealthy ways to meet needs, I noticed that these daydreams, quite a lot of them, they were not just a way to escape what may have been happening in that present moment, but also they were a way to meet a psychological need. So for example, I may notice in the past, okay, there are these daydreams, they seem unrelated, but actually a reoccurring theme is they are creating validation for me. So they're making me feel better about myself. So I realized, okay, well, clearly there, and with therapists, I was able to understand more. Okay, so clearly these daydreams are in an unhealthy way helping me to meet an issue of low self-worth. So then we will look at, okay, how do we meet that need of healthy self-worth in the proper way? So look at the content of your daydreams and see if there is a pattern. And you may notice that it is actually helping to meet a psychological or emotional need that you're not getting in real life. And if you notice, oh yes, this is actually helping me to meet a need. Let's say, for example, if you feel powerless in your life situation, and then you notice these dreams are making you feel powerful, then that would be an indicator that, well, you need to go and find ways, healthy ways, to regain that sense of personal power. And of course, therapists can help you to see things that you cannot see. So for example, maybe you're living with unhealthy dynamics in your relationships and you don't know it. So they can help you to identify that, because that could be contributing to the chronic stress, to the trauma, and that of course then is leading to maladaptive daydreaming. Now, of course, it doesn't mean you can only use therapists. I just highly recommend that because it's a much more quicker and more easier way to deal with these kind of things. Of course, there are books on this, so I did, of course, do a lot of reading and my own research, but the primary thing, apart from what I mentioned before, was, using a therapist. So to recap, daydreaming is normal. It becomes an issue when we cannot stop and essentially get addicted to it. And this is known as maladaptive daydreaming. And maladaptive daydreaming, based on my own experiences in the past, is a psychological adaptation to chronic stress and unresolved trauma. This can also be known as a coping mechanism. So it's a mechanism of the mind that it uses to deal with these difficult experiences. For me, from my experience, I was having multiple levels of mental health issues. So this was depersonalization, derealization disorder, video game addiction, anxiety, depression, and some other things like that. So maladaptive daydreaming was on top of that. as a way to cope with all of those things. The primary way I learned to start to gain control of maladaptive daydreaming was through practicing daily mindfulness meditation. And this is because it was training me to be able to control my point of attention. So when my mind will pull me into a daydream, because I had been practicing controlling my point of attention, I could pull myself out quicker and quicker the more and more I practiced mindfulness meditation. It also helped me to be able to sit with difficult emotions and to experience the difficult psychological symptoms I was having. So I wasn't automatically allowing the daydream to take over to escape from it. I got better and better at sitting with the feelings and experiencing the symptoms and being able to accept it more and more. It also taught me to not become attached to the thoughts and the mental images I was having. So this meant I wouldn't simply react when the thoughts would come in and believe them or get caught up in my own mind, which could lead to maladaptive daydreaming. I was able to observe and respond, so I had more control over my mind. But of course this took time, it takes patience to practice. It's just like exercising any muscle, it takes time. I also had to address the root causes of why I was experiencing maladaptive daydreaming. So I had to look at the chronic stress, the painful emotions I was experiencing, and the unresolved traumas that were creating all of the mental health issues that I just mentioned. So only really when I was working with various therapists to resolve those, and also doing my own research in between the different sessions, but mainly working with the therapists to resolve these traumas and to understand unhealthy dynamics within myself and with other relationships I had. That was what I was able to do with a therapist, because they were able to see things I was not, and because they are trained and have experience, they know exactly how I can resolve these issues properly. They also allowed me to see what mental, psychological and emotional needs that I had, but I was not meeting in healthy ways. And then once they identified this, they were able to show me how to meet those in healthy ways. Because as an example, when I looked at the content of some of my daydreams, these were unhealthy ways to meet some psychological emotional needs. So for example, because I had such low self-worth back then, a lot of my daydreams were a way, without me realizing, to gain a sense of self-worth. So thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you like this video and if you want to hear more. And let me know in the comments if you want to know anything else about my maladaptive daydreaming experiences, and what kind of experiences have you had and how have you started to recover. Thank you.